Good morning, everybody. This is Anfleer here, and today I'm going to be covering a new topic. Sorry for the wait on this one, had to take care of a couple of things with work, and I got sidetracked with a couple of other games. So, without further ado, God Key. God Key is a really unique mechanic, and I'm actually quite fascinated, and also, frankly, really like how it was done. This is a bit of a side topic, but to explain how it works in-game and why I enjoy it so much, I want to talk about how other Roblox games handle God Key and God transformations. An issue that I find is that most games typically have a transformation that will usually be immediately ditched in favor of the new one. As much as I love it, DBOG is incredibly guilty of this.
Say hello
My fellow Americans,
Goku.
I would like to introduce you to Goku.
DBOG will do this with any transformation, and the issue hasn't ever really been resolved. They've introduced mechanics like the grade system to make it so that you can have transformations generally be spec'd into one kind of category, but all it really did was make the already strong transformations even more stronger. It's always kind of bugged me, especially when you see in Dragon Ball and other shows and such, when they have a transformation that's outclassed, they still prefer to use it, either it be for energy efficiency, for just generally gauging how strong an opponent is, or because there's no reason to go all out all right away. I know it's a small and kind of tedious detail, but I really appreciate that Final Stand has a unique introduction to God forms. They instead have more utility than your standard transformation. I'm sure everybody knows by now that there's only two races in-game that feature transformations for God forms, and that is Saiyan and Namekian. Both of them offer roughly the same idea and how they work with some mild differences. Saiyans have weaker stat outputs, giving a 5 in all categories, minus speed, but having reduced drain, whereas Namekians have an increase in stats but have higher key drain. Your God Key is something that you'll only notice when you're in your God form, and it'll slowly drain away with time. Using moves and such will both drain your normal key and your God Key, taking about 70% of your standard key while only draining from 30% of your God Key. The only way to gain God Key in a God form is to punch things or to charge your key when your standard key is at max. Fucking take a shot every time I say key, this is gonna get real old. Your God Key will only be visible when you're in a God form, and it will regenerate passively when not in a God form, but it is incredibly slow. Meaning, the only way you can really stay in your God form is by punching things or by making sure that your standard key is at full, which is difficult as the God forms do actually drain your standard key, which is a bit of a shocker. It's at an incredibly low rate, but because of this, this also means that the form does hinder your standard key charge. The reason I like this so much is while the forms themselves are incredibly weak, the actual strength of these forms comes in the passive. Double damage and double defense. This is incredibly good, but it's only applicable if you're fighting somebody else who doesn't have a God form active at the moment. So ideally, you'll be fighting somebody else who will have a God form, or doesn't, and you'll both be effectively duking it out in base form. You'll keep fighting the other person until your God Key is completely depleted. And then, that'll force you down to your next strongest form. I really like this. This worked with how Goku fought Beerus and how the others fought mainly other godlike beings without or with their God forms. God Key being a separate resource forces the players to still have to rely on their weaker transformations because they still serve a very powerful fallback option when they're out of God Key. While Saiyans may not be as strong, this allows them to be able to play the long game, where Namekians are inherently stronger, but just generally aren't gonna last as long if they're not careful with how they spend their ki. Again, I'm a huge sucker for this. Like I mentioned before, every Dragon Ball game just serves God Key as just this thing that doesn't really exist and purely functions as a direct upgrade. Having it so that these forms actually innately give an increase in your base stats by a very weak margin is really cool. And even if you're fighting somebody else who's using God Key, you're still getting some level of a stat buff. Yeah, they're weak at the moment, but it makes sense when you're figuring out that it leaves room for something like Super Saiyan Blue or Beast to give higher stat increases, but also potentially increased key drain in both your God and standard key reserves. Of course, God Key was actually seen as incredibly weak on launch. It didn't have the same features as I mentioned. Originally, it was a 50-50 split on using moves. You weren't able to get God Key back on hit, and generally it just was incredibly weak. And again, it didn't help considering only 2 races have access to it. This also means Tuffles aren't able to possess you, which is a plus, but it also means that they can't use Symbiotic Dive, which can be seen as a bit of a nerf if you have a Tuffle that's got Perfected Dive. It's actually led and sparked a lot of discussion between the strength levels of something like Legendary Super Saiyan and Super Saiyan God. Of course, there isn't much of a reason to perfecting the God forms due to their innately weaker stat buffs, but you are, supposedly, given a reduced ki drain, making it still worthwhile to perfect. All in all, when Space Update, comes out whenever it feels like it, Super Saiyan Blue and the other transformations will come out, along with other races that didn't get a God form. Of course, as the updates roll out, more and more races will get God Ki, but there's a pretty good chance not every race will get a God form when Space comes out, though I hope this is wrong. Tuffles do interest me the most, considering the fact that they don't have any forms of God Ki and don't have any ways to combat it. Again, it's actually harmful if you want to help your teammates and they have a God form, making Namekians and Saiyans kind of a complicated relationship. But that's just a side tangent. Overall, God Ki serves as not necessarily a direct upgrade to your arsenal, but more of a utility kind of thing. You need to know when to use it and how long it's going to last for. For the most part, it is just a direct upgrade though. More so in PvE. In PvP, where charging ki is incredibly difficult to pull off, it's just a matter of fighting until your God Ki runs out, and then forming down to something that's not as strong but will do you just fine. As it stands, God forms are in a pretty good state right now, since they now have increased speed stats to make up for it. Which, on a side note, I really appreciate Super Saiyan God got a speed increase. Yes, it is a bit weird to break from the 555 stats, but I do appreciate it because going Super Saiyan God does slim you down a bit. Which, yeah, doesn't make you weaker, but I like the idea that it simply just condenses the muscle down, which makes sense as to why you've still got slightly higher speed than the rest of your stats. Also, for balancing, it just makes God forms able to compete. Thank God. Overall, though, there's not a whole lot to say about God forms. It's pretty simple. The most that's interesting about them is just the fact they introduce God Ki, which is pretty nice. As the updates roll out, God Ki will serve more of a purpose and will be more widely known and used by other races. While God forms themselves aren't particularly strong, you can do a few things to help make them compete. One of the most important things that's worth noting is the Harmony, Burning Fighter, and Dragon Jewel capsules. These all affect God forms and are actually incredibly helpful. Mainly Harmony and Dragon Jewel. Combining these two allows you to reduce your ki drain by a pretty substantial amount, allowing you to really emphasize the strength of these forms, which isn't the stats they offer, but instead, the actual passives. Of course, these capsules may be a little bit up for debate now that speed is actually an increased stat for God, but I think it's still really good overall. So again, experiment with your capsules and see what you can do. It pays well to be sure to be reserving your ki and only save it for evasives or important times. When you're in a God form, it's best practice to just stick to fisticuffs. Otherwise, you'll be burning out of it real fast. Though, I imagine if you've perfected a God form, you may have some more wiggle room to be able to actually use your moves. Remember, your ki isn't necessarily just split in terms of drainage, it's actually a second reserve. You can use a Kamehameha or a melee move, and the ki will actually be split among the 2 meters. So if you use Bone Crush normally in base, it'll take 100%, but if you're in a God form, it'll take 70% from your base ki, and the other 30 will go to your God ki. So in a way, this also helps with your ki control, which I do think is worth noting as well. For the Saiyans especially, it's good that you have a lot of ki max. Hi, editing Anflare again here. Snake also made it so that ki control no longer scales with your God Ki. So, I am so terribly sorry for any Saiyans or Namekians out there who are wanting to make a God Ki build. I am so sorry. The assistance of Harmony and Dragon Jewel capsules are incredibly important in terms of trying to sustain the mode. You can run out pretty quick if you're being very reckless with your attacks, especially when most people don't have it mastered. I say like as if nobody's done the evil alignment and just wished for perfection, but I have some faith in people who are going for UI. Anyways, I believe that pretty much covers most part for God Ki and just the 2 transformations we've got at the moment. Ideally, I hope this guide will still be useful in the years to come, or whenever Space comes out when most races have a God form, as there's not a lot of documentation about it right now. Anyways, I hope this video was generally informative and you maybe learned a few things, or you have a refined knowledge. In either case, I've been your host for today, and if I don't see you today, and if I don't see you tomorrow, then have a good day and have a good tomorrow. See ya!